President Trump is defending the U.S. airstrike. On Twitter Friday, the president wrote, in part, Soleimani, quote, should have been taken out many years ago. Mr. Trump also said the attack was to stop a war. But lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have had a mixed reaction to the strike.
The president's decision may add to an already dangerous and difficult situation in the Middle East. This action may well have brought our nation closer to another endless war.
This morning, Iran's master terrorist is dead. And as we've seen in recent days and weeks, he and his terrorists posed an ongoing and growing threat to American lives and American interests.
The question is why the administration chose this moment, why this administration made the decision to remove him from the battlefield when other administrations, both parties, decided that would escalate the risks, not reduce them. I've yet to get an adequate answer to that question.
Well, let's bring in Antjuan Seawright and Shermichael Singleton. Antjuan is a CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist. He is in the Palmetto State, Columbia, South Carolina. And Shermichael is a Republican strategist in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me.
Antjuan.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Antjuan, some of the Democratic lawmakers are focusing on the administration's lack of congressional notification. What is the strategy behind this approach?
Well, I think they just want to make certain that we understand separation of powers and understand that every branch of government has a responsibility regardless of who the president is or will be in the future. And I think it's only right that they are raising these concerns. And then you have to remember there's some members of that caucus who have served this country, who have family members serving this country. And we've been down this road before of being in a posture of a war for reasons that we really do not need to be in. And so I think it's just a matter of concern. I think that this is the right approach to take because Trump will not always be president, and there will be presidents who will come after him, and we just want to make sure there's some infrastructure in place for the future to be laid out.
Now, Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida was one of the sponsors of a bill that would have banned the use of funds for military action against Iran without congressional approval. But now he is backing the administration's actions. Shermichael, why are some of these Republicans changing their positions here?
Well, I think the cat's been out of the bag on this topic for a long time now, before President Obama, going all the way back to former President George W. Bush. And Antjuan, my dear good friend on the Democratic side, would have to acknowledge that. But look, I think a lot of Republicans are going to support the president, and I think I would warn members on both sides to be very cautious with their public statements, as many of them do not even know what a lot of the intelligence information and evidence was that the president was able to review along with the Secretary of State. From my understanding from reporting from the Associated Press and other outlets, a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that there was convincing enough intelligence from the intelligence community that led to this ultimate decision that the president went ahead and went with less than 24 hours ago. And so I think as more information comes out, members will then be in a proper position to be able to articulate their position in support of or against.
Yeah, Shermichael, I don't disagree with you because you're one of my dear friends who I so respect on the other side of the aisle. But I think what some Democrats I've heard from saying is funny how Lindsey Graham was briefed or knew about this days before this happened, but yet not other members of the Gang of Eight or not other members of Congress. And the only thing I think people are saying is we should just make sure we're all on the same page, because when you think about foreign policy, people do not view that in the eyes of Democrat, Republican, blue versus red. This is about the red, white, and blue, and I think we should always treat it as such.
Well, let's hear what some of the Democratic presidential candidates had to say about this. Let's listen.
This morning, we could be on the brink of a new kind of major conflict in the Middle East. I hope the administration, I pray the administration has thought through the second and third order consequences of what they have chosen. American lives and global stability are at risk.
Trump ignored the advice of his own security officials, and listened to right-wing extremists, some of whom were exactly the same people who got us into the war in Iraq in the first place. His actions now put us on the path to another war, potentially one that could be even worse than before.
But at the same time, when you think about what this president did, it is not clear to me, and I have a lot of questions and concerns about, did he think about the repercussions of what this is going to mean?
It's also the case that if we have learned nothing else from the Middle East in the last 20 years, it's that taking out a bad guy is not a good idea unless you are ready for what comes next. But one thing I am certain of right now is this. This must not be the beginning of another endless war.
So clearly all singing a very similar tune, being very critical of the president. Antjuan, which candidates does this help or hurt?
Well, I think it definitely well positions Vice President Biden to lean on his sets of experiences, being the former Vice President of the United States and having to go through these type situations before. I think he's well positioned to be able to speak very loud and clear and even proudly about his set of experiences. But I don't know if I would use the word benefit, because I think the country suffers when we get into the posture of war. And going back to what I said earlier, I think this is more about infrastructure down the road, that we be able to support the efforts that have taken place, regardless of whether you agree with the president or not.
Before yesterday, it looked like the 2020 issues were going to be the economy, health care, perhaps the impeachment, arguably. Shermichael, does this sort of change things now? Does this put national security, foreign policy front and center, the race for the White House 2020?
Oh, absolutely. And I think probably to the dismay of many, many Democrats, I think for the next several days, if not the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about the issue in the Middle East. We're going to talk about what type of response can we or should we likely expect from Iran. I think the conversation is going to be around Russia and China, what role they may play, if any, depending on how far and quickly this escalates. And so I think all other domestic items, such as the impeachment inquiry and other issues, I think will take a back seat, which I think in many ways benefits the president. I don't think this is something that Democrats particularly care for, particularly as they wanted to really utilize this month before the February 3rd Iowa caucus to make the case to the American people about the president behaving inappropriately.
Benefit the president depending on how it ends out. Now, guys, finally, let's just sneak in one last question here. I want to end with the same question for both of you. As you look to the 2020 field, who's having a big week? Who's having a bad week? Shermichael, let's start with you.
I'm going to say who's having a good week is Bernie Sanders. I think when you look at the amount of money he raised and the amount of individuals who gave to his candidacy speaks volumes about where he is. And I really think it surprises a lot of people who thought he would have been out of this thing quite a while ago. I think a candidate who had a very bad week was Julian Castro. The former HUD secretary and mayor is someone who spoke articulately about matters of race in our country, but was unable to really connect effectively with enough voters early on in some of those key swing states like Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah, dropping out of the race is probably qualifies you as having a bad week. Antjuan, what do you think?
I think the person, the entity that had the good week or the best week would be the Democratic village. When you think about the top candidates who raised money, Bernie Sanders, Mayor Pete, and some of the others, and when you add those numbers up compared to what the president raised, not to mention the committees and individual efforts out there, look, I think Democrats are well positioned to compete with the Trump money machine going into 2020. I think the person who had the bad week, in my opinion, is Mitch McConnell. When you think about some of the information that has come out from the Russian efforts, and now you have individuals who are tied to Rudy Giuliani who are willing to speak up and turn over messages. I think that's going to be not good for him going into this impeachment effort that the Senate will have to take upon, because guess what? He's well positioned with the White House in terms of how he wants to structure this, but there's no way you can ignore the hardcore facts from emails and transcripts that have come out lately. And so I think this presents a very challenging week for the majority leader in the Senate.
All right, gentlemen, a lot to talk about, not enough time. We appreciate you joining us. Antjuan Seawright, Shermichael Singleton, thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.